everybody. Welcome to the Rethinking Economics Finland second webinar on the economy, naturally. My name is Riina Bhatia. I'm briefly going to share you a couple of words about Rethinking Economics Finland, who we are and what's our aim, before Ruben will take on chairing the discussion with Dr. Toni Ruuska, who we are very lucky to have today to discuss with us the imperative of economic growth and the ecological crisis. But before we go into that, not sure if many of you are aware of what Rethinking Economics is, but we are an international network of students, academics, and professionals. And we really aim to build a better economics in society as well as classroom. We come from a variety of backgrounds and disciplines, but what unites is us that we think that the economics that is being taught in universities is quite narrow, and it's sometimes even uncritical and detached from the real world. Moreover, there is not room for critical discussion and debate, and that is essentially essential for any student to engage with real problems, real world problems in classrooms. So this is why we're also organizing these events, where we hope that students from economics and other backgrounds can come and share their thoughts about the real world and how economy is being taught at universities. And our primary aim is without doubt, to change how economics is thought and discussed. And to do that, we organize campaigns and events, and we engage in projects. So if you're interested in joining us, I'll post our social media outlets as well as a form where you can sign up as our member. It's for free, and you will receive our emails. And if you opt out, that's also possible. And just follow us on Instagram or Facebook and join our Slack channel. We have really interesting stuff coming up this spring. We'll be a little bit more quiet during Christmas time, but then when January comes, we'll be happy to have you engaged with us in our spring events. So that's it from my side. And yes, my name is Riina Bhatia, and I'm currently chairing the organization that we just recently established in Finland a few months ago, actually. And here, thank you, Ruben. You can see the rest of the board. So if you have anything you want to ask or discuss, you'll be able to find at least most of us in the Slack channel and social media outlets as well. So thank you very much from my side, and I'm hoping that you're enjoying the discussion today, and I encourage you all to actively pose questions and challenge our speaker, Toni Ruuska, today. So thank you very much. Over to you, Ruben.
Yeah, thank you, Riina. That was a brilliant presentation of Rethinking Economics. And I will just take 5-10 minutes to explain, how do I go? Yeah. To explain the reasons why we decided to start with this seminar, this series of seminars on the economy and nature and the environment, and also explain a bit like what is the idea of this seminar for today. So basically the structure of today's seminar is that the first 10 minutes we're just gonna introduce Rethinking Economics, the seminars in general, and more specifically this idea of the interactions between economics and nature, or rather the way that economics makes sense of nature. And then we'll delve into the real discussion with our guest, Toni Ruuska, which will be revolving mostly around this question, which is, are actually the economic growth imperative and life support systems of this planet compatible at all? And if not, why, and all the consequences that this has for both academia, but also society in a broader sense. So after that, we will take some time for opening the debate. And we really much hope that this will be as open and organic as possible. We're going to try to leave really much room for sharing ideas, questions, opinions, because the idea is, of course, that these seminars, they have a kind of pedagogical background. They're not meant to just lecture people, but we want to actually exchange opinions and, well, just bring about this idea of creating a community of heterodox economists, or at least heterodox economic students, in Finland. So really much feel welcome to participate in it. And even if you don't have any really clear idea in mind, just like feel free to ask questions. Like everybody's really welcome to participate. All right, but without further ado, let's just jump into a really brief historical review of what we mean with nature and the economy. And of course, there is plenty of different ways that we can approach this topic. We thought, okay, we can also approach it from, say, a methodological point of view, from a philosophy of science point of view. That's something we did, for example, in the previous event we had about a month ago. Today, for example, we're going to have a more political ecology take on it with Toni. And the idea was that maybe the first 5 minutes, we're going to just present a really brief historical review of how the concept of nature evolved in economics since the beginning. And this is basically like a really brief summary of it, like going from the idea of nature as an input to nature as a commodity. And nowadays, perhaps nature as a social imperative. So what we mean as an input is just like this idea that like when nature appeared in the first economic textbooks or manuals, when the physics class were talking about the importance of land and the origin of value, etc. That was the first time that nature was treated in a more, how to say, economic sense. And basically that's the same idea that was recurring in other political economies from Smith to Marx for a few centuries. Like nature was just treated in terms of land. That's the way it usually appears in economic textbooks, together with capital and labor as the three main inputs of production of the economic cycle. And that continues, as I said, for a few centuries until more recently nature became a commodity. And that was far from being a really neat and harmonious process of just evolving concepts. It was actually quite a contrasting one, full of clashes of ideology, one must say, especially in the 20th century, the past century. Not for nothing is often referred to as the age of ideology. And especially there was these two contraposing poles, that of Marxism and that of what it then became neoliberalism, or anyway, what I like to define market environmentalism. So on the one hand, you have the idea of like going towards more physical metrics and understanding the use value of nature. And on the other one, a more monetary approach of meaning of pricing everything. So placing a money value on absolutely everything, including, of course, nature. So this idea that we can include any natural externality with monetary pricing, etc., it comes from this clash of ideologies. And that's basically what we had until a very recent past, this idea of nature as a simple commodity, until we started to kind of clash against the clear limits of endless economic material expansion. The first critique started already in the 60s and 70s, and this idea of holding spaceman versus cowboys economy. So critiques, of course, are really, really various of environmental economics, and we don't have time today to delve into them. That would require a separate seminar. But basically, it's just to introduce this idea that from a two very neat separation of two universes, the economy and the environment, we move towards a more integrated approach. For some, and that's basically what you find also in the first reports on sustainability, the Brundtland report of 1987, etc. You have different spheres, which are the society, the economy, and nature, and they just overlap, and that's what we call sustainability when they meet. For others, this is just not enough, and that's not really sustainable in the real sense of it, so it's just a weak definition. And that's when the concept of strong sustainability was introduced, and in that sense, we see the economy as embedded in society, which is at that point also embedded in nature and the natural environment. So the three are integrated. And from this last perspective emerged, for example, the idea of a donut economics, something that is really popular nowadays, but simply the idea that that economics or the economic system should find a safe and just space in between social and environmental boundaries. And therefore we have this idea, I like to propose it as a bit of a provocative statement, especially given the topic of today's debate, is actually nature becoming a social imperative? And is that what we're seeing, for example, with the growing environmental movements and climate events? And I, for example, again, provocatively, I would suggest that maybe we could call this 21st century as the age of climate movements, or at least that is the tendency that we are seeing in the first few decades of this century. So based on this really brief overview, and I would like to ask Toni to take the stage now. The first question would revolve exactly around this idea of the imperatives, the social imperatives. On the one hand, the social imperative for nature and nature sustainability, and on the other one, the social imperative for economic growth. I have not spent any word on explaining what the imperative for economic growth is. Of course, I assume that most of the participants already know, but of course, Toni, if you want to introduce the frame of it in a few words, that would be really nice. And also if you can kind of explain to us or give us your understanding of where this imperative for economic growth comes from and how does that relate to the imperative for nature and natural sustainability.
Thanks, Ruben. I think you can hear me. I can show also some slides if you allow me. Thanks. I will share my screen now. Yes. So yes, I'm used to explaining these things. I guess for the past 10 years already, I have a business school background. I studied my bachelor and master's degrees in Helsinki School of Economics, and then went back for a doctoral dissertation, and I defended my PhD thesis 4.5 years ago. And since then, I've been in University of Helsinki, postdoctoral researcher, and now university researcher in Viki, in the faculty of agriculture and forestry, and in the Department of Economics. And in there, I think we have perhaps the most heterodox economics department in the whole country of Finland. We, of course, have the basics of neoclassical economics and neoclassical environmental economics, but then we also have courses on ecological economics. We have course on degrowth economics, which I teach together with Pasi Heikkunen and Christopher Vilen. And then we have political economy. We have Marxist perspectives on the economy and economics. So it's quite a varied department, although quite small. And we have a bachelor program on food economics and the environment, and then we have food economics and consumption master's program where we teach with our research network and group called processual studies on sustainable economy. But let's go to your question, Ruben. Just let you know a couple of things I've been working on. This year, Sustainability Beyond Technology came through Oxford University Press in March, together with Kestävän elämän manifesto, a Finnish collection of texts with Pasi Heikkunen from the past 7 or 8 years, targeting, I guess, mainly the question of growth. And I've been studying the impacts of the growth economy to the environment for the past 10 years. I dealt with that issue in my PhD thesis, and also the rewritten version of the PhD thesis called Reproduction Revisited, Capitalism, Higher Education and Ecological Crisis. And also we studied the growth question through technology in this Sustainability Beyond Technology, which is an edited volume. And like I said, this Kestävän elämän manifesto is a collection of growth critical texts that we have been doing for the past 7-8 years. But this, I think, the growth imperative and the critique regarding the growth imperative, it has a long history already. It's almost as long as the whole sort of growth imperative, because it's relatively young as a political goal, as an economic goal. It has only sort of it's a sort of post-Second World War phenomenon, and it is coupled with things like Keynesian economics and and the development of GDP as a tool to monitor the growth in production and consumption. But let's say, I think the most fundamental critique regarding and targeting the whole growth paradigm, growth critique, growthism, if you will, was the Limits to Growth report in '72 to the Club of Rome project on the predicament of mankind. And it's a weird moment, because at the same time, we can see, if we look at the ecological footprint calculations and the ecological footprint network, it's the same time as this report was published. It was the exact same time when, let's say, the human aggregate ecological footprint was on a sustainable level. And since that, it hasn't been. But I think that, for example, the degrowth movement, I guess the most prominent movement in Europe, for example, that is criticizing growth economics and the paradigm of growth, the growth imperative, it sort of takes its inspiration, and it's part of the same tradition that was sort of started with Ivan Illich, André Gorsch, Cornelius Castoriadis, and others. Also Nicholas Ceausescu-Roegen and Herman Daly, and those grandfathers of ecological economics. Well, but let's dig down to the growth imperative so we can sort of understand where does it come from and why there is such a thing ongoing or even out there. Many sort of counter critiques to the people who criticize growth politics and growth economics is to say that, well, in nature there is growth. And we say, yes, but it's cyclical. Biological growth is always cyclical, according to the seasons and natural conditions. And this kind of growth has biological limits depending on the ecosystems. Of course, it's in that way that there is also this thing called reckless growth. It does happen in nature, but it's always checked, because growth requires a suitable environment. We can say that cancer cells are a good example of reckless growth, but the cancer dies when the body dies, right? So yes, there is growth in nature, but it's cyclical. And we should separate cyclical from perpetual growth. We can claim that there is really nothing natural about perpetual growth. And at the same time, we should note, like I said already, that the paradigm of the growth imperative as a political or economic goal is very young. It's only Second World War thing. And if we look at what is actually going on in nature, an organism or a population cannot grow perpetually on a sustainable basis. And another thing we should separate from the perpetual growth and cyclical growth is compound growth, which from a historical perspective, from a critical economics perspective, like degrowth economics, we can say it's really an anomaly of the industrial age. And it's created, the opportunity was created, of course, by this planet, by creating what we call fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, which have given us a once in a universe chance to utilize Earth resources in an accelerating fashion, which has created an illusion for us many that perpetual and exponential growth can be sustained. One thing that I've learned in these past 10 years that I've been teaching and studying the topic is that people don't often realize what actually the exponential or compound growth means. This is just an obscure or maybe trivial example from the Case for Degrowth book. Just an old anecdote of a advisor who asked just just a small prize for his or her good advice from the king, and said that I just want the 1 grain of rice in the first square of the chessboard, and then I want to be doubled in every square. And the king said, it sounds reasonable. And here we can see what the doubling means in 64th square of the chessboard. It's 18 billion grains of rice. Of course, this is a different thing that we're talking about here. We usually talk about 3% compound growth. For example, in the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, 3% growth is the target. But even 3% is a heavy, it has a heavy toll on the ecosystems of this planet, like we can see from this calculation. With 3% compound growth, the economy doubles in size for every 24 years. With 3% growth in the world economy, the world economy would be 10 times bigger in 2100 and 200 times bigger in 2200, and almost 4,000 times bigger in 2300. So we can sort of appreciate that this is some sort of madness to expect that we can sustain a 3% world economy growth for many years and still somehow be able to avoid civilizational collapse, alleviate climate change, take care that biodiversity loss doesn't go in a worse direction. But also we have learned, of course, by monitoring the GDP and the world system, the global ecosystems, and how things are manufactured in the economy, that the growth of the GDP always equals the growth of matter energy throughput. There is no such thing as immaterial economy. We are material creatures. The economy is fundamentally material. Every production process is material. And thus, based on substantial empirical and convincing theoretical grounds, we can say that there is no argument for decoupling, the thing that we could detach economic growth from negative ecological impacts. Every production process, every time we consume, every time we produce, it has material consequences on the environment. And I really wouldn't like to go to the topic of decoupling and green growth, because I truly feel, based on empirical evidence and theoretical argumentation, that they are myths. They're nothing but myths to keep on sustaining the sort of political and economic landscape that we have right now. But with this said, I haven't really touched upon the growth imperative, and that's what I want to do next. Already in the 70s, this equation, the IPAC equation, which means that ecological impact equals the size of population times the level of affluence times the level of technology. So we can also say that actually the ecological crisis is mainly due to 3 interlinked issues. How much humans we have here, we should take into consideration, but I guess even more so, how much a certain bunch of us, of the human population, consumes, how affluent it is, what kind of economic organizations we have, and also how much modern, complex, and resource-intensive technologies we have in place. And I have, for example, in the technology book that I showed you briefly, try to understand what is the relation between capital accumulation and investments and technological development. And I've named it that it really is this thing called a capital technology alliance, because our economy is fundamentally hooked on economic growth, and we can sustain the growth by investing in technological development, from which we get new technologies, which produce money for the investors who invest the money to new technological development. So this is sort of this expanding circle or cycle, if you will. A few things about the dominant economic system. We can call it capitalism. It has been called capitalism. I think there are good premises and grounds for calling it capitalism, but we can understand, if we try to understand the nature of the system, why there exists such a thing as the growth imperative. Important thing to consider is that in this system, we are producing mainly for the markets, whereas in previous societies, also in the feudal system, production occurred for direct use mainly. Of course, there was some surplus that was traded and exchanged in the markets, but it is a different system compared to ours, where market actors, economic actors produce for the markets rather than for direct use. And because of this, there is, of course, the separation between producers and consumers. And also there's a separation of the people who own the means of production, the factories, the companies, the natural resources, and the people who work for them, the wage laborers who collect a wage from their working hours. The economic actors try to make a surplus, kate, to maximize profits in order to accumulate capital, in order to invest in the future expansion, to be able to compete in the markets. One of the best ways, or perhaps even the only way to succeed in the markets is to grow, is to look for new customers, to make bigger profits, to be able to invest more and more in the future expansion of the business, which means also that the credits and investments are the basis of reproduction together with growth. John Bellamy Foster's and Magdoff's book is actually called What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism, but I nevertheless changed the topic just a little bit for this talk. Well, the quote goes, overarching environmental problems are not the result of human ignorance or innate greed. They do not arise because the owners of the businesses are morally deficient, although some clearly are, nor it is simply due to lack of proper regulations. It is precisely because ecological destruction is built into the inner nature and logic of the present system of production and distribution that is so difficult to end. And here we get to the absolute contradiction, I would say, between the growth imperative and the ecosystems of this planet. And this is the question we need to pose, of course. How can we expect that a system that is constantly driving towards expansion, how could it be sustainable? And John Bellamy Foster claims that capitalism as a world economy, divided into classes and driven by competition, embodies a logic that accepts no boundaries on its own expansion and its exploitation of its environment. The Earth as a planet in construct is by definition limited. This is the absolute contradiction from there is no earthly escape. And I've tried to illustrate the absolute contradiction in this slide. And the absolute contradiction is really a contradiction between a finite planet and a system that is based on perpetual and compound growth. And we can answer that there simply needs to be growth in capitalism, just that we can keep the people in the office, we can have jobs, we can have pensions, we can have free education system, we can have this sort of modern way of life. And that's all based on growth, which also means that there's really an absolute political contradiction also trying to fix this system, because it needs growth. And of course, that means that every solution that people in the sort of political system, in the mainstream economics, all the solutions are, of course, based on growth. But at the same time, we know that the growth is breaking this planet apart. And just to add a couple of things why there has to be growth in the capitalist organism or organization. Well, quite simply because the banks lend money, which is debt, which has an interest. Every investment in the system comes with a return on investment claim. And of course, there's a fierce competition of the markets, and also a thing called unequal exchange, which means the bigger players, the more powerful nation states, they get to dictate the rules of the game. And we also know, of course, from the economics, from the neoclassical economics even, that when there is no growth in a system that needs economic growth, there's a loss of employment. And this is called, as you know, the Okun's law. So there's really a tendency or a need, an imperative to grow the system because it's based on growth. And the growth makes sure that we can pay pensions, we can we have money to sustain a free education system, our hospitals, our infrastructure, and so on. But the things that people usually don't consider, that this whole system is actually based on cheapness of things. It's based on cheap natural resources, minerals, wood, water. It's based on cheap money, that you can loan money with a reasonable interest rate, for example. It's based on cheap labor costs. It's based on cheap care costs. It's on cheap food. And I would say the fundamental condition for the industrial age and the age of growth is low energy prices. But also, tragically, that lives that are lost in the process can be justified in the name of development and progress. It has been the case in the history of growth and industrial age. The sixth point, the reasonable or even ridiculously cheap energy price for the past 150 years or 100 years, it has been the condition for the growth era. From this figure, we can appreciate the exponential curve. We can see that coal, crude oil, and natural gas, their growth in use. We can say that the traditional biofuels, mainly wood, it has been quite stable. And then we can see the small slices of what we now term a renewable energy, which I think there is nothing really renewable in wind turbines or solar panels or even hydropowers, large dams, because they are made from non-renewable materials, although they use the heat from the sun and the wind power and, for example, the movement on the seas. Oh, let's see how this curve is. It's quite exponential, and no wonder we can see that the material footprint resembles the curve. We can see how the global GDP and material footprint curves resemble the fossil fuel utilization curve, and we can see in the era of the great acceleration after the Second World War, we can see how the socioeconomic trends resemble the exponential curve: world population, GDP, foreign direct investment, urban population, primary energy use, fertilizer consumption, large dams, water use, paper production, transportation, telecommunication, international tourism. Of course, not in the age of the corona. But nevertheless, we can see the socioeconomic trends and their impacts on the Earth system. Some of these graphs They are not alike. For example, we've been able to sort of stabilize the ozone amount in the stratosphere, but at the same time we can see how greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, they have sort of exponential curve. Ocean acidification, coastal nitrogen, mainly because of the industrial agriculture practices, shrimp aquaculture, tropical forest loss, domesticated land, and so on. So we can see how the growth imperative has an impact on the Earth system and how it has created what we call the ecological crisis. Of course, it comes. We know that the growth imperative sort of requires a consumerism and consumerist society, where politicians, business leaders, even celebrities are worried that we're not consuming as much as we should be consuming. It's no wonder that people are squeezed in cities, because cities are really the motors for economic growth and consumption. No wonder that we have this let's say a production and consumption system that is not really based on recycling, but on waste disposal. And because of this, we have massive problems in sink capacity of this planet. It's not only relating to greenhouse gases, but also more what we call physical waste, and also pollution of the environment and water streams. While more and more people are cramped into cities, we have a food system based on monocultural farming that is entirely based on external outputs, namely fossil fuels and industrial fertilizers, industrial pesticides, and herbicides that are mined from massive open pit mines throughout the world, and then refined in factories and then shipped back to the farms and to be utilized in monocultural farming, which is really degrading the soil while trying to produce more and more food for the growing human population. So I will check the time. I'm trying to rush. Yes, I think I have some 10 minutes to go. If we see this picture and pause a bit to think about it, it's sort of a doom and gloomy and doomy picture that we are in. And I think what makes the picture even gloomier is that we don't really see but the tip of the iceberg what is going on. In the public discussion, we are, of course, very worried about climate change, but I would say climate change is only one symptom of a bigger problem, that is the overshoot. This is a post from William Rees, quite renowned ecological economist, and he writes that climate change is not a real existential threat, overshoot is. And the overshoot occurs when people use energy and natural resources faster than ecosystems can regenerate and pollute beyond nature's assimilative capacity. Overshoot means that we modern humans are consuming, polluting, destroying the biophysical basis of our own existence. And overshoot is ultimately a fatal condition. And climate change is merely one important symptom of the overshoot. We cannot solve climate change or other major symptoms of overshoot, biodiversity loss, tropical deforestation, overfishing, land soil degradation, pollution of everything, the possibility of pandemics, and so on, in isolation from the others. To achieve sustainable production and consumption means less production and consumption. So the only way to achieve sustainability from the state of overshoot is to produce and consume less. And of course, this is a terrible thing to say in a culture that is based on growth, where every solution is growth-based. But it makes sense. If we produce too much and the ecosystems are on the verge of collapse, of course, the only viable option is to not grow, is to not produce and consume that much. And of course, we know that the world economy is not working on an equal basis. We know that there are people that are not able to fulfill their basic needs. And of course, we wouldn't like to sort of remove the target of growth from their lives. Of course, we want to see that the whole human population is able to fulfill their basic needs, but the overshoot, of course, is not the problem, let's say, of the global south, but it's the problem of the global north that is putting us to this fatal condition, which means that if we continue this way, there will be civilizational collapse, and there will be collapse of ecosystems awaiting us in the future. So for the past 10 years, I've been trying to understand how this kind of system that is based on expansion, based on producing more and more, based on consuming more and more, how could it be changed to something different? And of course, I'm not alone in this. There are many, many people in Europe, in South America, in Asia, in Africa, in all over the world are thinking the same questions. And the degrowth movement is a prominent movement trying to understand how could we make good with less, how we could survive, how we could take care of each other, how we could make sure that we are able to leave something for the future generation, like the Brundtland report claimed in the 1987. Well, like William Rees said, yes, the overshoot is the problem, and the only viable option is that we consume and produce less. But this shouldn't be a catastrophe, and I think we should sort of try to understand the degrowth economics simply looking at our lives from a different perspective, because degrowth economics it's not growth economics, it's not stationary state economics, it's not recession, it's something else, where we try to understand sort of what is sufficient, how much we need, what is enough, how we can take care of the planet, how we can take care of others, how we could understand nature and its resources, not from private property perspective, but from commons perspective, how we could sort of produce convivial technologies, how we could rethink the economy where everybody sort of has sufficient livelihood and we're at the same time able to take care of each other and the planet. And of course, I don't have time to go deeply into the topic of degrowth, but I just actually finished the course. We have a degrowth course, like I said, in Wiki, and yesterday we had the final lecture, and I can send you some of these materials and links if you want after the talk. But just briefly, what is degrowth? Of course, it's critique of the growth economy and growth economies. It's also an alternative vision of society. It's some kind of utopia, some kind of activist movement where I'm also involved, and many other scholars, activists. but it's also a prominent field of research in environmental social sciences, where scholars and activists call for a planned and deliberate transition from overshoot to sustainability. And if you want to check out, for example, research and degrowth, you can go to degrowth.org, or just more generally the movement, go to degrowth.info. In Finland, we have Kohtuusliike, and also we have regional degrowth movements, this in Northern Karelia, this in Salo, and this in Kymenlaakso. But I think I should leave it here to have room for the discussion. Feel free to comment. Of course, this was quite a rushed talk with quite provocative statements, but I can assure you that sort of I tried to put together a interesting and provocative talk, but also the things that I've learned in the past 10 years, or let's say the most important lessons that I've learned in the past 10 years. Thank you. Let's have a good Q&A and discussion now. Thank you. Bye.